Hello and welcome back to Trista's Reading Room. Today we are looking at Chip and the Book of Rose Leaves by Alexandria Miracola. And this was published on May 4th, 2023. For those who wonder, the answers are waiting. Are you ready for an adventure? In a quiet meadow tucked away in Everleaf Forest, a young rabbit is waiting. Chip whispered a prayer weeks ago, a question that he is longing to know the answer to. But as more time passes and still no answer comes, Chip begins to wonder something quite different. Did his prayer really matter to God at all? Instead of being met with silence, though, strange tales of a treasure and a guardian named Abeline reached Chip's curious ears. The stories promise that anyone who discovers this treasure will find the answers they long for. And Chip is determined to do just that. But an unexpected adventure awaits, full of fire and drakes, racing rivers and untold wonders. It promises to be thrilling, but not safe. The only question that remains is this: are you courageous enough to join Chip on his adventure and uncover the answers with him? This is book 1 in the Everleaf Tales. It's for ages 6 to 10, and there are no content warnings. You can find it on her online bookstore at www.2125books.com in paperback form. Here's a bit about the author. Alexandria Miracola is a Christian fantasy author and owner of 2125 Books, an independent publishing company. She loves stories that draw readers' hearts back to God and remind them that light is always overcoming darkness. Her first novel was Penelope Grace and the Winter Carousel. She is currently off somewhere writing about dragons and brewing a pot of tea. This is the inspiration for her story. What a journey this has been. Chip's tale began over 3 years ago on a chilly March day when I happened to look out my window and saw a rabbit with a chip in his left ear. How little I understood then what God was about to do. I thought it was just going to be a silly and simple story about a young rabbit who goes on an adventure. And while Chip's story is full of both silliness and adventure, his journey became much more than I realized it would. While ideas were still forming, I read a Charles Spurgeon devotion, and he described how our prayers are like rose leaves pressed between the pages of a book. Though I didn't know all the details of Chip's journey yet, I now knew what was waiting for him at the end. So no matter how old you are, 5 or 95, my prayer for you as you read Chip's adventure is this: that when you feel lonely and unheard, you remember that your prayers are preserved carefully, your tears lovingly treasured like diamonds of heaven. You are not left alone in the waiting. He hears you, and although we don't always get the answer we want, God has a way of pulling everything together for good all the same. After all, I didn't understand what God was going to do through Chip's adventure, and I would have been content to write a silly story about a rabbit and leave it at that. But God knew what was waiting, and I'm so grateful. What wonders we'll see when we leave the outcome up to Him. You can find Alexandria on Goodreads, Facebook, Instagram, and on her website. I also want to note that there are illustrations throughout this book, and on the front it says a springtime tale to color. So you can go through this and you can color the fun illustrations throughout as well as read the book. Chapter 1. Welcome to Everleaf. Not so very long ago, on a spring day much like this one, a young rabbit named Chip was waiting for something. I'd tell you what it was now, but I wouldn't want to spoil things. The forest of Everleaf was Chip's home, and oh, was it the grandest of forests, full of old, strong oaks, covered in rich green moss. Rutted paths, nearly overgrown now, carved their way through the land, though it seemed only the animals traveled them. Everleaf was one of those forests that set the imagination ablaze. The longer you spend walking beneath its boughs, the less surprised you would be to find a fairy flying for cover behind feathery ferns, or a group of elves disappearing from view just around the next bend. And yet, surrounded as he was by the wondrous, Chip was still waiting for just one thing, and it seemed it would never come. He waited and waited until the sun sank below the treetops and the animals returned to their burrows and nests. The great owl Nesbit emerged from the grandest oak in the clearing, and even still, Chip was there. Blinking his wide amber eyes several times, Nesbit looked down at the young rabbit. "Still waiting, are we?" he asked with a rustle of his feathers as he settled on his nighttime perch. Yes, not a little disappointed that all his diligence had gotten him precisely nowhere. Perseverance is what's needed here, young chip. Perseverance," Nesbit proclaimed, startling several disgruntled birds from their dreams. "Yes, Nesbit, thank you," Chip replied, trying very hard to sound grateful. He and Nesbit had the same conversation every night, and the owl's commanding declaration of perseverance had yet to make him feel better. Thankfully, his mother's clear voice rang out from the entrance of their home at just that moment. After offering Nesbit a quick "good night," Chip bounded away to their cozy burrow, eager for supper after yet another long day spent waiting. He had only just entered and laid eyes on the feast Mama had prepared when a voice loudly intoned, "Perseverance, my lad, perseverance!" and Chip nearly jumped out of his skin. His father appeared, waving a stick in the air with great authority, almost dropping it as he shook with amusement at his own joke. "Not you, too," Chip reprimanded, though his laughter soon echoed his father's. "Another inspiring speech tonight, I take it," Joshua teased. "He means well," Chip's mother chided. "I know, Bess," Joshua replied with a grin. "But it was worth it for the way this one's fur bristled in fright when he heard the dreaded cry of perseverance." He waved the stick in the air once more, chasing a laughing Chip around the small log table, nearly crashing into it as his son dashed out of reach. "Now see here, Joshua Radish," Bess cried, though Chip knew she wasn't really angry. "We spent all day gathering this supper, and I'll not have you send it flying with your shenanigans." A practiced expression immediately transformed Joshua's face as he and Chip obediently froze. "Of course, Bess dear, absolutely no shenanigans here," he said, carefully setting the stick down on the floor, a look of mischief barely concealed by his mock seriousness. Bess fixed him with a look that made it clear she was not at all fooled, then turned to her son. "I hope you didn't fill up on that sweet meadow grass today. Your papa and I have a special treat for your birthday." She gestured to the center of the low table, and Chip's eyes grew wide. Nestled amidst the usual grass and leafy greens was the largest clump of clover he had ever seen, and several choice flowers, enough for them to each enjoy too. "Where did you go find these?" Chip breathed in awe. "A fair distance," his father replied vaguely. They sat down, all of them eager to enjoy this special meal. Chip rubbed his paw against his left ear as he always did when he was excited or nervous. Unusual though it may seem, it was Chip's left ear that had given him his name. On the night he'd been born, Mama always said he was instantly revealed to be perfect in all ways to them, and that included the chip missing from his left ear. No one could say why he had been born with it, but it made this young rabbit uniquely Chip, and his parents had immediately known what his name ought to be. The anticipation now too great for them to wait any longer, Joshua looked up and said a simple prayer. "Without you, we wouldn't have such a lovely spread before us," he continued with a good-natured wink at Bess. "Such a warm, shenanigan-free home. We offer you our thanks. Amen." "Amen," Bess and Chip echoed, and they all began to eat, enjoying each delicious flower petal and savory clover leaf. But prayer had been on the young rabbit's mind for weeks now, and he couldn't keep quiet about it any longer. "Have you ever waited for an answer to a prayer?" he asked in that direct way that only children ever seem to have. Joshua and Bess were quiet for a moment, exchanging the type of look that only parents ever seem to share. "Many, many times," Mama answered, and Papa agreed. "Well, did you get an answer?" Chip pressed. "Did you get what you asked for?" "In answer to your first question, yes, in time," Joshua replied. "As for the second, not always, Chip, but I believe that's because we don't always ask for what's best." Chip looked down, thinking hard about what his papa had said. Joshua chuckled. "Not quite satisfied with that, are you?" Chip shook his head sheepishly, though he knew Mama and Papa were never angry with him for asking questions. Joshua ruffled the soft fur between Chip's ears. "That's all right, Chip," he said, his eyes gentle and kind. "You just have yourself an honest conversation with him before you go to sleep, and things will be getting clearer all the time." Chip nodded, kissed his parents good night, and scampered off to bed. At first, he didn't take his papa's advice. He was, after all, an endearingly stubborn little rabbit, and what he really wanted most of all was an answer to the prayer he had whispered weeks ago. Days and days he had waited, and he just couldn't seem to let it go. So Chip tossed and turned and waited and fretted, wondering if the answer he wanted would ever come. But the longer Chip fretted, and the longer he wondered, the more brightly a different question began to burn like fire in his mind, until at last Chip sat up and spoke aloud something I imagine we all have thought from time to time. "I'm changing my question. I've waited ages for an answer, and now all I'm wondering is this. Do my words, do my prayers, really matter to you at all?" Before an answer could arrive, Chip had drifted off to sleep. A late-night snack brought Chip to the clearing the next evening, though perhaps in his heart he was wishing that an answer might come to him if he listened very closely as the wind went whistling through the trees. As it happens, listening closely led to something that Chip did not expect. He was just hopping closer to a patch of grass, softly illuminated by starlight, when a loud grunt sounded from above, nearly sending our young rabbit scampering for home. But some mumbled words soon followed, and when Chip moved back a ways, he saw that it was only Nesbit, asleep on his mighty watch, though the owl, of course, would never admit it. Chip shook his head with a small smile, wondering to himself how often the owl called for perseverance in his dreams. "Chip, my lad," Nesbit mumbled, and the rabbit turned. "Yes, Nesbit?" he asked, but found that the owl hadn't actually stirred. Still he was speaking, and Chip hopped forward quickly, the better to hear him. Waiting, Chip. Must persevere." This punctuated by a loud snore. "Abeline." Abeline? Chip was instantly intrigued. What was the owl saying? What was Abeline? "Nesbit?" he called. No answer, but surely you know as well as I that a young rabbit never gives up so quickly. He bounded to the tree and began thumping his strong hind feet against its trunk, hoping to jar the owl from sleep. Back he ran to gaze up at Nesbit's perch and measure his success. Minimal. "Nesbit!" Chip cried out more loudly, earning himself several agitated chirps from a nearby swallow's nest. He ignored them, determined that he would have an answer. "Nesbit, what is Abeline?" "You'll never wake him, my lad," came a familiar, quavering voice. Out of a burrow, which Chip knew to be the largest in Everleaf Forest, emerged Romulus Took, the badger. He was very close to ancient, though no one knew his exact age or dared to offend the distinguished old badger by asking. "Could you try, Mr. Took?" Chip asked hopefully. "I can do you one better," the badger answered, raising his bushy eyebrows. "I can tell you who Abeline is myself." Chip barely remembered to breathe. He was so astounded by this turn of events. Romulus let out a deep, rumbling chuckle. "Follow me, my lad. Stories like this one are best told by candlelight." He turned and lumbered back toward his burrow entrance, Chip following eagerly behind. It was widely accepted that Romulus Took was an old sort of badger, though a well-loved one. He was notorious for collecting all sorts of trinkets from the human world. The badger was fascinated by them all, but it was candles that he loved best. Chip's father often related the day, quite some time ago, when Romulus Took had brought the first candles to Everleaf. The skeptical and the enchanted alike had accepted Romulus's gift with curiosity, which quickly turned to delight as candle by candle, a small corner of Everleaf Forest was illuminated by dozens of flickering lights. He never would say where he found the candles, or the countless other oddments that filled his cozy home. No matter how many times Chip asked, and the badger had long ago lost track. All Romulus Took ever offered was a smile and wink, and perhaps a self-satisfied, "Oh, elsewhere." Chip did not know why Mr. Took was choosing to so freely share what he knew about Adeline, but he certainly wasn't going to question the decision and risk the old badger changing his mind. They were far into the tunnels now, and Chip could see the wavering shadows of several candles' flames dancing on the earthen walls. Soon enough, they emerged into a cozy, hollowed-out space, where all of Romulus Took's favorite trinkets were kept. Immediately, Chip hopped onto one of the cushiest things he'd ever had the pleasure of sitting on. Romulus told him they were called chairs. Whatever they were, Chip loved nestling in them while Mr. Took told one of his many well-known stories. Tonight, the young rabbit was filled with more anticipation than usual, for he guessed, rightly, that tonight's tale would be unlike any he had heard before. What's that? You're not quite sharing Chip's anticipation? That is a problem. Well, perhaps you're right. Until next time, then. And that's it for today. If you want to learn more about Adeline and what exactly that is, check out this book on Alexandria's website or stay tuned for the giveaway. I'm going to be giving this copy away. And thanks for joining me.